everyone. My name is Annie Rogers, and on behalf of the ADDitude team, I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD experts presentation titled Maladaptive Daydreaming versus ADHD, Important Similarities and Distinctive Differences. ADHD minds tend to wander. They also sometimes fall into hyperfocus or intense focus on a captivating task or activity that may last for hours. But these ADHD trademarks are distinct from the phenomenon called maladaptive daydreaming, which is a more compulsive and repeated engagement in immersive daydreaming that is so vivid and fantastical that individuals may get lost for extended periods of time. So in today's webinar, we will learn about the difference between maladaptive daydreaming and mind wandering in its relationship to ADHD, and how clinicians can assess and treat the compulsive daydreaming disorder. Leading today's presentation is Dr. Nirit Soffer-Dudek. Dr. Soffer-Dudek is a licensed clinical psychologist and head of the clinical psychology track at Ben-Gurion University in Negev. Her research focuses on unique states of consciousness in relationship to psychopathology and stress. She is also director of the Consciousness and Psychopathology Laboratory and scientific director of the International Consortium for Maladaptive Daydreaming Research. Before I hand over the microphone to Dr. Soffer-Dudek, I have just a few housekeeping items. Those of you tuned into the live webinar may submit your questions at any time by navigating to the text box under the video player. To download the slides, click on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. And if you're interested in the Certificate of Attendance option, look for instructions in the email you will receive about an hour after the live broadcast. If you are listening in replay or podcast mode, visit ADDitudemag.com and search podcast number 412 to access the slides, the webinar replay, and the Certificate of Attendance option. If you support the work we're doing here at ADDitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit ADDitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for ADDitude Magazine. If you sign up now, you will start your subscription with the fall issue of ADDitude, which features a full-length article about today's topic, maladaptive daydreaming, and it explains in depth some of the research we will be reviewing today done by Dr. Soffer-Dudek. Finally, the sponsor of this webinar is Play Attention, Improve Executive Function and Self-Regulation. For more than 25 years, Play Attention has been helping children and adults thrive and succeed. Tufts University School of Medicine found Play Attention significantly improved attention, executive function, academic performance, and behavioral control of students with ADHD. Your program will include a lifetime membership and a personal executive function coach to customize your plan along the way. Home and professional programs are available. Call 828-676-2240 or click the link on your screen to schedule your free one-on-one consultation. Visit www.playattention.com to learn more. ADDitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without any further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Soffer-Dudek. Thank you so much for joining us today and for leading this informative discussion on maladaptive daydreaming.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. So hopefully I'll be able to talk about everything I want to during this short speak. So I'll just start. I'm going to talk today about the links between ADHD and maladaptive daydreaming, However, the title is a bit misleading. I don't know why I wrote maladaptive daydreaming versus ADHD, because actually most people with maladaptive daydreaming, they will meet criteria for ADHD, but I'm going to talk about that. But mainly what I want to talk about is mental health differences between immersive daydreaming and mind wandering, two different mental patterns that may lead to ADHD. So that's kind of my corrected title. But I'll get to everything. So before I get to when the mind wanders or when things go wrong, I first want to talk about what's called normal daydreaming. Because daydreaming is kind of a benign word. It's not necessarily related to psychopathology at all. And we do know that everyone daydreams. So we have to talk first about what's normal before we can talk about what's maybe abnormal. So mind wandering is a term that's sometimes used to convey daydreaming, and daydreaming is sometimes a term used to convey mind wandering. They're pretty interchangeably used. So mind wandering or normal daydreaming is internally generated thought. That's even the scientific definition of mind wandering, which is really a very broad definition. So anything which is internally generated, which is not my current task, if I'm doing a task which is external. So if I'm doing a task, washing the dishes, and I'm not thinking about washing the dishes, but I'm thinking about something else that my mind has generated, that would be considered mind wandering. And everybody does that. That happens to everyone to a certain extent. One really very rigorous study, which has been cited a lot, found that they used an app and they actually sampled a few times during the day and asked people what they were thinking of at that moment. And they found that over 50% of the time, people reported mind wandering, which means that most of the time we're not necessarily in the present. We're thinking about the future, we're thinking about the past, we're thinking about other things, and that was very normal. And this study was on about 2,000 people. It was very rigorous. So it's completely normal to daydream or to mind wander to a certain extent. That's not pathological in itself. Also, a lot of researchers have discussed or theorized about potentially adaptive roles of daydreaming or mind wandering. It has been hypothesized that it's important for future planning, mental breaks from whatever it is we're doing that's maybe important for our functioning, creativity, to just let our minds wander and get to places that we didn't necessarily plan ahead, and even creating one's own life narrative. So all of these things have been theorized to be functions for why we have mind wandering, why it has developed evolutionarily or something like that. So it's probably adaptive if everyone does it, and it's so normal. However, first of all, that same rigorous study that I mentioned before is just one of the studies showing that when your mind wanders, you're less happy. You have more negative emotion. You report less happiness. You report more stress. We also have a study that was also with experience sampling that we asked people if a minute ago, before their phone beeped, if they were thinking about the past, the present, or the future. And we found out that when people reported that they were thinking about the present, they had less stress and their content of thought was more positive. Whereas if they were thinking about past or future, their content was more negative and their stress was higher at that moment. So there's a lot of empirical evidence to show that perhaps mind wandering or daydreaming, or maybe too much of it, is not so adaptive. So maybe it's too much of a good thing. I'm not sure, but that's what the evidence shows us. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the DSM and about psychopathology. So now that we're clear about how daydreaming is normal and widespread, but still related to some not so good things, then maybe we can talk about psychopathology. So in the DSM-5, well, in the DSM-4, we had the diagnosis ADD, which was ADHD without hyperactivity, right? Which is the name of this platform, the ADDitude magazine. So now in the DSM-5, we have the ADHD inattentive subtype. They call it ADHD even when it's without hyperactivity. And this diagnosis is, well, it's kind of broad. It really focuses, and I'm sure probably most of you know this if you're interested in ADHD, it focuses on the behavioral or end result of a difficulty in attending. So DSM likes to have lists of symptoms. So just difficulty in attending, that's not enough. We have to have lists. So they have a list of different things that can be caused by difficulty in attending. And I'm talking specifically about the inattentive subtype without the hyperactivity. So it's symptoms like being easily distracted and performing careless mistakes because you're doing things without attending, and difficulty carrying out instructions because you weren't attending, and being forgetful or scattered or having difficulty organizing. So this list is basically the end result or the behavioral result of a difficulty in attending. And the thing that I want to talk to you about today is that there could be different reasons why people would have difficulty in attending. And that's my kind of like small biff with this diagnosis. It's very broad. And when we diagnose as diagnosticians, we have this rule that we want to diagnose something that explains the clinical picture best. The problem with the DSM is that there are a lot of comorbidities. So that's one of the criticisms on the DSM. It presents things like there are different diagnoses and every person would just fit one and not the others, but then we find that in the clinics, in actual practical work, people just, they have like depression, ADHD, PTSD, and OCD, and they go out with 4 diagnoses. So that's kind of a problem because the DSM kind of assumes that we have these different categories, and it's when someone walks out with 4 diagnoses, it kind of raises a question, are we looking at this right? Is this right? Because it doesn't really match. So with ADHD, that's really a problem because there are a lot of clinical conditions that could cause someone to have difficulty in attending. And then they would have all those symptoms that we saw before in the list because they have a difficulty in attending, which could be for many reasons. And then, they would fit the list. So why don't everyone get a diagnosis of ADHD? Well, that's because we have this rule when we diagnose that if something explains the clinical picture better, then, the other diagnosis is not needed. So like if there's depression, and in my view as a psychologist, I believe that the difficulty in attending is part of the depression syndrome, then I can say, okay, so there's no need to diagnose this person with ADHD as well. I can just diagnose with depression because we want each person to have as little diagnoses as possible. We don't want to send them out with 8 diagnoses. So we can just, diagnose with depression, and we don't need to diagnose ADHD inattentive type in this case, because if I believe that the difficulty in attending is just part of the depression, then the ADHD diagnosis would be superfluous. So I want to talk to you about different types of internally generated thought that could lead to this list of symptoms. And then I'll get to maladaptive daydreaming. So there are different types of potentially distracting internally generated thoughts. One of them is random distractions, variable attention, hyperassociation, which is typical mind wandering. And maybe this is familiar to you because this is the mental pattern that people generally think about when they think about ADHD. Most people with ADHD, with or without hyperactivity, they have this difficulty in attending, this scattered mind, this just mind wandering, and without any specific content necessarily, just very distractible and very hyperassociative. And, it's just something that's very difficult to define, very, very difficult to define. But this is like the typical ADHD. This pattern, which I wrote here, is the typical or prototypical ADHD. Another thing that could cause people to have trouble concentrating and attending is rumination, which is repetitively thinking about the past, repetitively thinking about things I could have done differently, or maybe about my symptoms, repetitively thinking things which are very non-helpful, like asking, why did this happen to me? Why does it always happen to me specifically? Or, self-criticism, which is very repetitive. And this kind of thought pattern of rumination has been very related to depression. It's also related to anxiety, but it's very related to depression. And it's a very strong predictor of depression. And this is also something that causes someone to not be in the present. They're more in the past, more in thinking, why has this happened to me? Or, remembering things that happened and that were bad and replaying them in my mind, which is also kind of related to PTSD, having flashbacks of bad things that have happened. So these two things related to depression, anxiety, and PTSD, and they're all things that would cause someone to have difficulty in attending. And not necessarily, these things would not necessarily justify a diagnosis of ADHD if the clinical picture is better explained by, depression, PTSD, anxiety, whatever. Another thing is worry or planning about the future. And this is very related to anxiety, to like general anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, panic disorder. Many anxiety disorders are characterized by worry, by thinking about, if I go there, what would happen and how would I react and what would people think of me and all these questions. And that would also cause a difficulty in attending. If that's what you think about all day, then you can't concentrate in class and different tasks or work. Another mental pattern is obsessions or mental compulsions. So obsessions are like thoughts that are very complex, and they're very intrusive, and something which is not necessarily rational, and I kind of know that it's irrational, but it doesn't go away, and it's very intrusive, very non-controlled, and it just repeats itself. And mental compulsions are like when people they feel the need to do some mental act they perform in order to feel safe, like counting or checking in their minds, like a checklist inside their heads to make sure they did something. So these things are related to obsessive compulsive disorder. And again, this causes a difficulty in attending. This takes a lot of mental resources and causes difficulties in attending. So people could potentially be diagnosed with ADHD in addition to their OCD. And we know that that is a very common comorbidity. And researchers have written about that it doesn't really make sense because OCD and ADHD are kind of the opposite of one another, because OCD is very controlled. It's too much control, and ADHD is not enough control. So it doesn't really make sense. And the explanation is that, again, obsessions and compulsions, they take a lot of mental resources. So people have difficulty in attending. And now we get to the last pattern, which I want to talk about in this talk. And that's fantasizing. And I'm saying fantasizing and not daydreaming just to underscore that I'm talking about real, like narrative daydreams, like real stories. that are very interesting and complex, with things happening with the plot. And not everyone has these kinds of daydreams, or maybe you could say it's maybe a continuum. And some people have an ability to have these very, very vivid daydreams, and not everyone has that ability. So that's something that's definitely not characteristic of every person with ADHD. But it is characteristic of some, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Yeah, so I already said the first one is prototypical ADHD, and the last one is maladaptive daydreaming. So now I'm going to talk about what maladaptive daydreaming actually is. So maladaptive daydreaming is, I'll just say it's a suggested syndrome. It's not a formal diagnosis because it doesn't appear yet, not in the DSM, not in the ICD, not in any formal psychiatric manual, but we're hoping it will. We're trying to get there so that one day it will be recognized. But we did define it as a syndrome, as a suggested diagnosis. And it's defined as compulsively or addictively engaging in extensive fantasy activity that replaces human interaction. It's instead of actually going out there and being with people for real in real life, and or interferes with academic, interpersonal, or vocational functioning. So people with maladaptive daydreaming, they feel a need all the time to daydream, and that really interferes with their functioning. And for them, that's the reason that they can't attend. So most of them will meet criteria for ADHD inattentive type, and I'll say that again later, but I'm already throwing that into this discussion. But for them, their experience is that it's because they just want to daydream all the time, because it's so much fun in the short term. Why is it so much fun? Because these people have an ability for very immersive daydreaming. Like, I don't have that ability. I research it, but I don't have that ability. I could have an interesting daydream maybe here now and then, here and there, but I don't have this ability to daydream for hours and hours on end and not get bored. I would get bored very quickly. And these people have an ability for very vivid daydreaming, and they feel it as very real. It's almost like a sensory experience. They experience it as very real. They know it's daydreaming. It's not psychosis. They don't lose contact with reality. They definitely know they're daydreaming, but they get very immersed, and they get very, like, totally into it. And they experience it as very real, like most of us experience TV. You know, when you watch Netflix or whatever, and you really enjoy it because you just get, you know, into it, sucked into it, and you forget about your environment. So that's what it's like for them. And I want to just say that some people have this ability for very vivid daydreaming, but it's not maladaptive daydreaming, because for them it's not maladaptive. It's maladaptive once it gets out of control and the person feels that this interferes with their life and they can't control it, and that they want to stop it, but they can't. That's when it's maladaptive. So it's very much dependent upon the person's own experience. Okay, so I don't want you to think that I'm saying that anyone who can daydream so vividly is necessarily diagnosable. It's only diagnosable if it really causes the person distress or impairs functioning, like everything in the DSM. The content at times could be completely unrealistic and fantastical. It could be about characters from movies or TV, like Harry Potter. It could be about invented characters. It could be things that maybe involve celebrities, and things that are very, very, very far away from the person's reality, which is different than, you know, some people who do like normal mind wandering or even rumination. They can maybe think about, you know, telling off their boss or answering their partner in a different way than they really answered. And that's more common. It's very normal. And with maladaptive daydreaming, it's more like, you know, imagining yourself hanging out with Queen Elizabeth. And it's very, very far away from life. And that's part of what makes it kind of like dissociative, because it's so far away from your life and it feels real. And then you come back to your life and it's completely a different life than you just lived in your mind a minute ago, and feels disconnected. The fantasies have a narrative, like I said before, with fictional characters, plots. There's emotional involvement. People could really, they become very attached to the figures. One person told us that she's in love with her fictional character, and more than she is with her husband. And, you know, they can cry and just really react emotionally during the daydreaming, which, as I said, could last for hours on end. So they could just, you know, close the door to their room and just daydream for hours on end and laugh and cry and walk around and just, you know, just like a person would watch TV, would binge on something on TV. And for them, it's really interesting. Some people have described it kind of similar to a soap opera because the characters can evolve over time. So, so like the characters grow older and then become parents and then become grandparents. So it could go on for years. And so like you could have the same characters for like 20 years of your life, and they have evolved and grown just like you have. And another characteristic is that the daydreamer yearns for the activity. They have an urge to do it because, as I said, it's enjoyable in the short run. And they just want to do it all the time. So it becomes like an addiction or like a compulsion. They just need to do it, they want to do it, and they feel distress when they can't do it. And a lot of the time they would seek solitude to do it freely. They know that it kind of looks weird from the side, so they want to do it freely when in their own house or room. And many times they would choose to do this over meeting friends, going to, you know, things that are related to their actual life. So this could be very debilitating. Another thing is many people use music to kind of trigger this special state, this like altered consciousness state where they get very immersed and they're like in a trance kind of. And the music helps them get into it. So this is kind of semi-controlled. It's like an addiction. It's like someone who's addicted to gambling or something else which is behavioral. So they kind of know that they're going to do it. So they put the music on and they, you know, they just feel an urge to go do it. And it involves very deep absorption, like I said, like total attention to this thing and oblivious to what's going on around you. Especially if they let themselves go. If they know they're alone and no one's supposed to disturb them, they can just go into this very, very deep absorption, like trance state. And another thing, aside from music, is that a lot of people have, it's associated for them with stereotypical physical activity. And this is different than the hyperactivity of ADHD, the hyperactive type, because hyperactivity is kind of like a non-instrumental activity. It's like agitation, just general physical motor activation where you just feel like you need to move. And with maladaptive daydreaming, it's more specific. There are people who pace, some people just go running, or when they're running, it becomes activated even if they don't want it to. Some people do like body rocking. Even one person told me about her headbanging. So it's a lot of stereotypical movements. We have some collaborations with pediatricians because in childhood there's a diagnosis called stereotypical movement disorder. So we kind of think it's that some of the cases could be future adult maladaptive daydreamers. So we have a few collaborations in that area. Some people just use their hand to just, you know, wave something in front of their eyes. They really like go into this trance state. It's a way for them to kind of self-hypnotize to a certain extent and go into this deep trance state. And also some people, because they get so involved in the storyline, they could do like mouthing dialogues, whispering like the dialogues, and gesturing, because they enact with their faces, you know, what's going on and the different characters. And people, again, they're not psychotic, so they know they're doing this. So when they get old enough to realize, you know, that this would be embarrassing to do in public, they won't do this in public. I mean, they would spin the stories in their minds, but not with the gesturing, not with the whispering. At a certain age, they would know to conceal that when they're in public, and only do that when they're freely in their own home, in the privacy of their own home. There are some themes that have been identified, like violence and idealized self, which is very important, because it's a lot of times people feel inadequate, and fantasy is kind of like compensatory, like the better version of me kind of fantasy. So power and control, captivity, rescue and escape, sexual arousal. Some people, we know from studies that some people have maladaptive daydreaming following trauma and abuse. Not everyone, some people. And we know that these people sometimes have daydreams that focus around being a victim, or being a rescuer, or being a perpetrator. So you can be in different roles, and they like play out these different types of roles, and their daydreams are a lot of the times focused around the trauma or some kind of trauma, as kind of reenacting it in different ways and playing around with it in their heads. And it's interesting, because in PTSD, there are flashbacks of the actual event, but this is different because they play around with it. It's flexible, which is very different from prototypical PTSD, where there are flashbacks of the actual event, and it's not so flexible. So here it is very flexible, and there's a narrative, and there are stories, and there are different types of characters and all that. So it's addictive, it's rewarding, like I said, in the short term, and it may become compulsive, addictive. I'm not sure which is the more accurate word. And afterwards, you know, they come out of it, like after doing it for 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, they feel guilt, and for the time they wasted, and how they're inadequate, and they're the only ones who do this. They feel shame, they feel like, you know, what am I doing? And it's so embarrassing for them. They feel lonely. They feel a lot of the times a disconnect between the fantasy and the real life, because in the fantasy, I'm this superhero, or everyone loves me, or I'm a celebrity. And then I come back to my real life, and it's such a large gap that I feel really bad about myself. So that, which deepens my need for escapism. So it's kind of like a vicious cycle. And a lot of people report that they kind of feel like the fantasy is really real. It's experienced as very real. And when they come back to reality, reality kind of feels unreal. So it's dissociative symptoms and feeling like disconnected from reality, which seems very gray and boring compared to the very interesting fantasies they have. So this is from a study from 2018. This is a citation of a woman who said, "I have been lost in daydreams for as long as I can remember. Some daydreams involve people I know, others don't include me at all. These daydreams tend to be stories for which I feel real emotion, usually happiness or sadness, which have the ability to make me laugh or cry. They're as important a part of my life as anything else. I can spend hours alone with my daydreams." This is a 20-year-old self-diagnosed female, and it's always self-diagnosed because, as I said, it's not a formal diagnosis. But there are a lot of people who have self-diagnosed themselves with this once they found out about this term. So we've done a lot of studies about maladaptive daydreaming in the past few years, and some of the things that we found out is that people who self-diagnose themselves as having maladaptive daydreaming that are active online in forums dedicated to this subject, They're usually very distressed. They have a lot of psychopathological symptoms. They have a lot of negative affect and dysfunction. There's a lot of suicidality, a lot of anxiety, depression, and a lot of OCD and OCD spectrum. OCD spectrum could be skin picking, hair pulling, and body dysmorphic disorder. So there's a lot of that, especially skin picking, which might be also maybe something that's related to getting yourself in this trance mode of, the self-hypnotic mode. So maybe people just pick at their scabs or whatever to get in the mode. So there's a really high comorbidity there. And also we found that there are high levels of dissociation, which isn't surprising. And we actually think that maladaptive daydreaming should be construed as kind of a dissociative disorder. So there's a disconnect from reality. There's a change in the person's sense of agency because they have all these internal characters in their minds and they feel like these characters are almost agentic. They don't take over their body like in extreme dissociation, but it does feel kind of like you have these different identities, sort of, because you can identify with a lot of them. And it's kind of like this whole internal world inside you where you have a different self. You kind of play around with different types of selves. So there's a lot of dissociative aspects to it. And so what causes maladaptive daydreaming? We think that there's this innate ability for very immersive daydreaming, which, as I said before, in itself, that's not psychopathological. But some people just lose control over it and it becomes addictive to them because it's just so rewarding. And then, it causes them problems and they can't stop. So that's one path maybe to maladaptive daydreaming. And other people, and I think this is the more common path that we hear about, they have this innate ability, but then couple that with stress. That could be traumatic stress. Some people have traumatic stress, but a lot of other people have non-traumatic stress like social anxiety and or just difficult childhoods, attachment issues, different kinds of stress. And they use this innate ability for very immersive daydreaming as a coping method. And escapism. So that's another pathway to maladaptive daydreaming. So now I'm going to get to the crux of the reason that we're here today, which is the relationship between maladaptive daydreaming and ADHD. So as I kind of said, earlier, most maladaptive daydreamers will meet clinical criteria for ADHD inattentive type. And we actually found 77%. And that's just because, as I said before, there are a lot of reasons why people would have difficulty attending to external tasks and concentrating in external tasks, like in school and work, and, just achieving their goals because, something is causing them to have like a mental pattern that's causing them to be somewhere else. And one of those mental patterns is fantasizing compulsively. So most of them do meet criteria. However, their description, and I believe them, is that this meeting criteria for this inattending is because of their compulsive need to, and their constant urge to engage themselves in this very immersive daydreaming. And this means that if maladaptive daydreaming were in the DSM or any other psychiatric manual for that matter, then, as a clinician, I would want to diagnose this person as having maladaptive daydreaming, and I would feel like the ADHD diagnosis in this case is not needed because it's, it's just the symptoms are better explained by maladaptive daydreaming. And as I said before, we don't want to just diagnose with many things. And if the problem attending or not attending is explainable by something else, then I don't want to diagnose ADHD. So that's my thinking, that if this were a formal diagnosis, then definitely some people who today get the diagnosis of ADHD, they would not need this diagnosis of ADHD. And so we did a study recently after we found 77% of ADHD inattentive type among maladaptive daydreamers. We wanted to do an opposite study, which would look at people with ADHD, adults with ADHD, and check how many of them meet criteria for maladaptive daydreaming. Because if we're correct that there's something here which is something else, then we shouldn't find such a high percentage, because such a high percentage says these things are the same. And then, what's the idea of saying, okay, maladaptive daydreaming, it's a new thing. It doesn't make any sense. If it was the same percentage, like 80%, then it's just the same thing. And we thought that it wouldn't be the same thing, and we were right. It's not the same thing. And indeed, we found that only 20% of adults with ADHD met criteria for maladaptive daydreaming. And that's quite high. It's not the percentages that I would expect to find in a general population. But this makes sense because this was a special sample. This was a sample of people who were diagnosed with ADHD. So what we're saying is that there's a pathway to get the diagnosis of ADHD that we think should be labeled maladaptive daydreaming. So these 20% of people with ADHD, in our view, should be diagnosed with maladaptive daydreaming. And that's what explains their difficulty in attending. So this asymmetry, this 20% versus 77%, that's kind of very important. And it kind of shows that MD and ADHD are not the same thing. And so basically what I'm saying is that there is mind wandering, which is typical for ADHD. It's like prototypical ADHD, inattentive type. And there's maladaptive daydreaming or fantasizing, which is the other path, or another path for ADHD. And I just want to say we have a website, the International Consortium for Maladaptive Daydreaming Research, the ICMDR. We're several research groups from around the world who are interested in this. Most of these research groups have been dissociation researchers before. And I'm leading this together with my colleague, Professor Eli Zomer, also from Israel, who coined the term maladaptive daydreaming and recognized this. And we have there the different scales that we use in research. There's a cutoff, and we've also developed a structured clinical interview for maladaptive daydreaming. We have all the research there, so it's if it interests you, you can go to the website. And now I'll say 2 minutes, I'll talk about treatment. So first of all, as I said, a lot of these people are distressed and they could use psychotherapy. A lot of the time it's escapism or trying to cope with other issues. So you should resolve underlying issues and psychological problems. You can also use cognitive behavioral techniques. I mean, in psychotherapy, again, that there are techniques for managing addictive behaviors, behavioral addictions. So this acts like a behavioral addiction. So that could also be useful. Mindfulness training, which helps you be in the present and not let your mind run away. And there's preliminary evidence that for some people, SSRIs could be useful. So there's possibly a role for serotonin, but this is very preliminary. So more research is needed. And that's it. The last thing that I'm going to say is there are very large communities online of people who recognize this in themselves or self-diagnosed maladaptive daydreamers. So on Reddit, it's, I think, the largest community. There's about 70 or 80,000, I think 75,000 people in this group called Maladaptive Dreaming, this subreddit. And there are Facebook groups and other platforms, cyber forums, whatever. And there have been a lot of articles, like dozens and dozens of articles on this. The media is very interested. People are writing us emails all the time and asking us to keep doing this and, telling us their personal stories. There's been at least one documentary that's even won some prizes. And it's just really, growing in the past few years. There have been even Ph.D.s on maladaptive daydreaming that have been approved already, and a funded grant recently for a researcher in Brazil. Yeah, so we're growing, and we hope to grow more in the future. Thank you.
Wonderful. Dr. Soffer-Dudek, thank you so much. This was a really interesting and sort of groundbreaking overview for us. I want to very quickly, before we launch the Q&A here, thank Play Attention once more for sponsoring the webinar. And I'll start right off with some questions specifically regarding that connection between maladaptive daydreaming and ADHD. You spoke of the 20% of adults with ADHD who would qualify as having maladaptive daydreaming. Do you know if those were adults specifically with inattentive ADHD, or was it any diagnosis?
That's a really important question. Unfortunately, in that study, we couldn't make this differentiation of the inattentive type versus the hyperactive type or the combined, just because in that study, we asked for documentation for their diagnoses. And the documentation for ADHD, it's just amazing how variable it is. And so this one is from a psychiatrist, and this one is from a neurologist, and this one's from like this place that they diagnose. It's just really different. And this one's from a general doctor and learning disabilities place. So it was so variable. And in a lot of these documents, they didn't have the subtype. So that's one of the problems with that study. And we're doing another study, which is more rigorous. And this time we're diagnosing ourselves with interviews. And so this time we'll have the subtype.
Okay, good to know that distinction there. And that leads into another question about most of this focused on maladaptive daydreaming in adulthood. In your mind, would there be a criteria that this behavior must endure for some period of time before a diagnosis would be made? I'm thinking, we often assume that children are more likely to slip into daydreams, and it's seen as a sort of normal developmental process. So is there an age at which diagnosis would happen, or a duration of time that maladaptive daydreaming must be experienced before a diagnosis would be warranted?
That's a really good question. Kudos to whoever asked that. I think that in the criteria that we specified, which were kind of like DSM-like criteria that we made up based on, what people told us, I think that we did specify a time. I don't remember if it's 1 month or 6 months, but I think it's 1 month. However, that's really an empirical question, I think, that should be answered by future research, because maybe some people, just, maybe in periods of stress, just daydream more. And, maybe there should be, I don't know, I'm not sure. I think, from my clinical experience, maladaptive daydreamers, it's constant. It's for years. So, if you have it, you have it. Yes. But I don't have a really good answer for this.
There were a number of people who wrote in and said that they felt that they had possibly engaged in something close to maladaptive daydreaming as a child, and maybe as a coping mechanism for ADHD symptoms or other symptoms, but that they felt they had sort of outgrown it. So that was sort of the question is it possible that this could be developmental for some people, at least?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's really important. We don't really have any published studies on children yet. We have several things that are ongoing right now. So in a few years, we will have published studies on children, but definitely there's a need for longitudinal research and understanding, if we can we need to diagnose kids. That's a challenge, because most people working on this don't work with kids. And, we just researched adults a lot. And, we have to have a different type of interview. And we've developed actually a questionnaire for children. It's not validated yet. As I said, nothing was published yet. So first of all, we have to, identify who these kids are. And then we need longitudinal research to see, what happens to them, how many will be adult maladaptive daydreamers, and how many will just grow out of it. That's such an important question. Unfortunately, the research is not there yet.
Mm-hmm. And you had mentioned that a criteria for maladaptive daydreaming, and an important one, is that it's seen as bothersome or impeding in your ability to lead your, the life that you would like. And a number of people writing in saying that, as family members, parents, or loved ones, it's bothersome to them, but not to the individual. Is it possible then, do you think that this would qualify as maladaptive daydreaming if it's impacting those around you, but not necessarily the individual engaging?
I think that's the difference between adult maladaptive daydreamers and child or teen maladaptive daydreamers. For children, it's a lot of the times it's not yet shameful. They don't realize that it's not a problem for them. They don't feel, small children, they don't feel shame about it. And, they could even gesture in class until they realize that this is causing them problems. That might take a while. So, all this shame and loneliness and feeling like this interferes with my abilities to actually create, real life relationships, all that stuff, that happens as you grow. At first, you just have this innate ability and it's really fun. And you just want to do it all the time. So you pace around in circles and you do this thing, and, the parents look and they say, what's going on? What's he doing? What's she doing? And it's just not causing you problems yet that you're aware of, or it's not causing you distress that you feel. And your parents might be really worried about you, or your classmates may make fun of you because you do these gestures, but you're not really aware and you don't really realize what's going on. And, adults, they really know how to conceal it. So I don't think that people would notice if they have like a partner who does this. Maybe they would think that he or she is kind of flaky or ADHD or distracted and forgetful and weird or spacey or whatever. But it's really hard to diagnose someone else with maladaptive daydreaming if they're an adult. This really depends on the person's own account of what's going on in their minds.
That's really interesting. On this topic of mostly children, but not exclusively, a number of people wondering about whether there has been any research to date on the connection between video game use and maladaptive daydreaming.
That's an important question. I think there is something starting. I don't think there's something that has been published. There have been published studies on the relationship between maladaptive daydreaming and celebrity worship, which might also be at least partly involves, online engagement in forums with these celebrities. But gaming specifically, I don't think there's been something that has been published yet. But that's a really interesting direction. I think that for some teens, the gaming could be like a trigger, kind of like TV, Beauty and the Beast or Harry Potter or whatever. So gaming could also be something that helps them kind of start and think about the characters, and then they continue on in their minds. But addiction, this behavioral addiction to gaming is actually very similar to maladaptive daydreaming, just, in people who maybe don't have this ability for maladaptive daydreaming, but the mechanisms could be very similar. It's also a behavioral addiction. Yeah.
Okay. A number of people interested also to know whether there is any research regarding the connection to autism spectrum disorder, whether this behavior is more common in individuals with autism, any connection there?
I have an answer for that.
Okay.
Yeah, there has been a study. There's definitely a connection. Again, this is related to the topic of stereotypical movements, which are very common in autistic kids. And the study that has been on adults that have been diagnosed as being on the autistic spectrum. So there were very, very high percentages of maladaptive daydreamers there. And so there's definitely a connection, and probably some kids who do these really like these movements when they're small, and they seem like in their own world, that, you know, definitely they could get this diagnosis of autism and could be maladaptive daydreamers. But they wouldn't get probably they wouldn't get the diagnosis of autism if they weren't also with, you know, social problems, communication problems. So it's definitely a real comorbidity. It's not like a confound. It's a very real comorbidity. So yeah, there's a really strong connection.
Someone wrote in with an interesting question on this topic. Could maladaptive daydreaming be correlated with autism in children who are aware of their difficulties and looking for ways to escape them? I suppose this could be true for many different diagnoses.
Yeah, I think that for any type of diagnosis and for any type of psychopathology, there's a spectrum of awareness and understanding and insight of what's going on with you, and if you're using something as a coping mechanism. So I think that's just independent of which diagnosis you have. With any diagnosis, there are some people who are very, very insightful, and some people or children who are not insightful. So yeah, so it could happen, definitely.
And you spoke in the presentation about the connection with OCD. And I thought that was very interesting, and specifically about the sort of body-focused, repetitive behaviors. And I just wanted to circle back and clear up. So are you seeing the skin picking and hair pulling, other body-focused repetitive behaviors during the maladaptive daydreaming? Like they're sort of unaware that they're engaging in it while deep in their fantasy?
Well, that's what I hypothesize. We don't know that. What we found is that, you know, we just measured. There were two different studies. There was one study where we did interviews, full psychiatric interviews, structured interviews that cover most of the diagnoses in the DSM. And we just found that in a sample of 40 maladaptive daydreamers, a lot of them, like, I don't know, 20, 30% of this sample met criteria for this diagnosis of skin picking, excoriation disorder. So it's just really high percentages. And we didn't specifically ask them if they do it during the episode. And in another study, it was a self-report study with 500 maladaptive daydreamers who filled out questionnaires. And we had an OCD questionnaire, and there was one item about excoriation disorder. And just, again, a lot of people marked that they have this, and there was a really strong relationship between this and maladaptive daydreaming. So I don't know. I assume my explanation is that it's probably another way to get into the trance mode, but I don't know. I mean, I don't have empirical evidence for that. That would need another study.
Studies abounding, such a complex and
lots of work to do,
overlapping, yes, condition, which leads to probably our last question, since we're just about out of time. One that I thought was very interesting, whether there have been studies on the parts of the brain that are actually activated during maladaptive daydreaming.
Unfortunately, we have not yet had any published studies on brain scans, but there is a study running. There was one that was supposed to happen a long time ago, but then was stopped because of COVID, and it didn't continue. But then one is happening right now, so I guess in a few years we'll have an answer.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I feel like we're really at the cutting edge with this conversation, that we're going to be hearing a lot more about maladaptive daydreaming, how it is seen in the context of many different diagnoses, including ADHD. And it's just such an interesting and nuanced conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Soffer-Dudek, for leading us through this today. I do not think this will not be the end of our exploration here, but we want to thank you so much for joining us today, and for everyone else who contributed your insights and questions today. We hope that you will come back for another ADDitude webinar. Next week, we will be featuring Cindy Goldrich on the topic of how to build relationships with your teacher this back to school season. So different topic. So to make sure you don't miss any of our future ADDitude webinars or articles or research, you can sign up to receive alerts at attitudemag.com/newsletters. Until next time, thank you again, Dr. Soffer-Dudek, and thank you everyone else for joining us today. We hope to see you again soon.